Welcome back to the Loose Framing Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Martin Olich, and you might notice something a little different. But joining me as always, we have...
Jesse Brock.
And for the first time ever, not new to us, but new to you, our permitting manager...
Hillary Weber. Hi.
Welcome, Hillary. We're going to get to you in a brief second as far as introductions go, but I did want to explain why our set looks a little different. We had been previously shooting at Lot 1901. We love those guys over there. We'll be continuing to shoot our spotlights at Lot 1901, but we're on the 34th floor of the, City Center building?
One Tampa City Center in downtown.
Overlooking the port with a beautiful view, and our parent company was nice enough to build us this sweet little podcast studio. So that's why we have a new look, and with the new look comes a bit of a new format, which is why we're introducing Hillary to the podcast. So let's start there, Hillary. What does a permitting manager do in brief?
So the primary function of my role at the Film Commission is to coordinate between filmmakers and all of our municipal contacts. So I work with productions and I take their ideas and what they want to do, and we translate that into something that makes sense for parking and fire and parks, and basically help translate that into something that can actually be accomplished in Tampa on public property.
And it's not an overstatement to say if you are filming in Tampa Bay, Hillary Weber probably has a hand in that, certainly for the logistics and the permitting, but also just resource gathering and connecting people together.
That's what I like to call the nitty-gritty of what we do.
Yes.
She makes our jobs a lot easier.
We're very excited to have her on board as far as the podcast goes. We're going to have an episode later on in the year, just chatting about what we do as a film commission and what our own individual jobs are. But today, we're gathering for a very, very special guest. Who are we interviewing, Jesse Brock?
Mr. Bob Layton, comic book legend.
And who is Bob Layton?
Bob Layton is a comic book legend.
Yeah, well,
he's the co-creator of Iron Man.
No. He's not the co-creator of Iron Man. You screwed it up already.
Well, he's the co-creator of Ant-Man,
yes.
But he kind of how do you say it? He revitalized Iron Man in the 70s.
He is one of two people that solely rescued the Iron Man comic book, right? It was on its deathbed. They were ready to put it to, shelved permanently. They had 8 issues left. And the way, and you'll hear Bob say this here in a second, but the way they treated dying books is they gave it to their newest staff members to cut their teeth on. And he totally reinvented not only Iron Man as a superhero, but more importantly, Tony Stark as a character.
Exactly. He focused more on humanizing the character of Iron Man and focused on Tony's inner demons, which Robert Downey Jr. does an amazing job portraying in the films.
Yeah. But Bob at large has credits on over 6,500 comic books. Like you said, he reinvented Iron Man, but he also is the co-creator of Scott Lang, Ant-Man, Huntress, Ghost. He worked for both DC and Marvel and was one of the creators of Valiant Comics, which when it sold finally in the 90s was one of the top 3 comic book companies in the world. So with that, before we transition to Bob, what's your favorite comic book, Jesse Brock?
My favorite comic book?
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm on the spot. I mean, growing up, I was never super big into comic books, but the comic superhero movie that I know the most about and liked the most was probably Spider-Man, honestly.
Yeah. Is it the original Tobey Maguire Spider-Man?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. With the Green Goblin and Doc Ock. And
you're not the Tom Holland or the other guy who's forgettable?
I mean, the newest, the No Way Home was fun, seeing all 3 of them in the same movie, but for nostalgic purposes. But I grew up with the original, the Tobey Maguire one.
What about you, Hillary? What comic books were you into, if any?
I actually did not grow up on comic books, so it was something that I came to love through the movies. But I remember when I got my very first comic book, it was the Batman Arkham Asylum, and I had so much fun with it because it was a new world to me. It was not something that I had spent a lot of time in growing up.
That's awesome. Comics. And did you watch the original Burton Batman back in the day? Was that a...
I did, yeah. I did watch the animated series with Mark Hamill as the Joker. Yeah, I loved that.
Mark Hamill's the best Joker.
Yeah, new to comic books, yeah.
Well, I'll save what I liked for the conversation afterwards. But with that, I want to welcome you guys back to our podcast, and I hope you guys enjoy this great conversation with comic book legend Bob Layton. Welcome back to Loose Frame Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Martinolich, and joining me now is my good friend, comic book legend, Bob Layton.
It's absolutely true. We are actually friends.
I've known each other for, 10 years now?
Oh, man, it's crazy, isn't it?
Let's start off, Bob. Give us a quick overview of your career. You've done over 6,500 comics to your name. You've created tons of characters. You created your own comic book company at one point.
Two of them.
So give us just like a brief synopsis.
I learned to read from comics when I was 4 years old. My sister, Sue Ann, sat down with me because I kept asking her what was in the balloons. Because I could tell what the story was, but I wanted to know what they were saying. And so she patiently sat down with me. It's really funny because I called her about a week ago and asked her if she could still recite Green Lantern's theme, which she can. It's been like 50 years, and she can still recite Green Lantern's Oath, from reading me comic books all this time. But as a result, I skipped grade school and graduated at 17, which is not in the early 70s. That's not a good thing because I couldn't get a real job. I wasn't an adult yet,
And you weren't on the East Coast, the West Coast. You're a Midwestern kid.
I grew up in the heart of corn country, in Indiana, and I wasn't going to be able to go to college, so I found out that there was these wonderful things that had all the accumulated knowledge of the world called libraries. And in these libraries, I can find books on art, I can find books on writing, and all this sort of thing. So I really started educating myself. And being a bit entrepreneurial, I started my own fanzine, this is before the internet, before any of this kind of stuff. What we used to do is make little fan magazines. We would sell them through, comic book trading newspapers and stuff like that. So I started this little magazine called CPL, and it wound up kind of snowballing and taking on a life of its own.
Yeah, and there really wasn't anyone else doing that at the time, right? I mean,
there were a couple guys, but we were doing it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
The CPL gang, as we were known in Indianapolis, we were really the only ones putting out books on a regular basis. And what I would do is I would send 25 copies to Marvel and 25 to DC and 25 to Charlton, and hoping that somebody would see it and see my artwork in it and maybe pick up on the fact that I was aspiring to be a storyteller.
And that actually worked out for you because a couple of years later, you ended up moving to New York. Well,
I moved to Connecticut first. I went to work for Charlton, the three-legged dog of comic book companies. Charlton was located in Derby, Connecticut, and it was like AAA baseball. It's like it was a really shoddy comic book company, but a lot of really great people got their start there because you could ruin a lot of books. Nobody cared. Yeah. And I was doing a fanzine for Charlton too at the time. They were trying to launch a new superhero line, so Marvel and DC had their own fanzine. So I tried to I did one for them called the Charlton Bullseye. But through that, one of the editors there were friends with the great Wally Wood, and as a result, Woody told Bill, the editor, that if I was ever on the East Coast, that he would take me on as an assistant. So I bumped $200 and I had an old Galaxy 500 station wagon, and I drove from Indiana, and I slept on some other cartoonist's floor that I had met at a con I actually threw in Indianapolis in '75. So I knew some guys from that. I actually put on my own Comic Con. So I've done everything.
You have,
yeah.
So how did you transition to Marvel, which I think is where most people, if you've heard of Bob Layton, it's probably because you've seen or read one of his comics while he was at Marvel.
If you blink, you'll miss my DC career. Yeah, I mean, because it was short, but that was part of the problem. You know me, right? The kind of guy I am. When you go up to DC, especially in those days, in the early '70s, and DC was very corporate because they were owned by Warner Brothers. And everybody dressed like they were at IBM, with the tie and the short sleeve shirts and stuff like that. And you go to these pristine offices, and you'd have to wait there, and somebody would come out and escort you to the editor's office. And they'd shut the door. They would take your art, and they would give you a paycheck, and then they would escort you out. Like they didn't want to be bothered with you otherwise. And then you go over to Marvel, and they buzz you in. And you hear like music everywhere. There's graffiti on the walls. There's Jim Owsley with a boombox and a 18-inch afro roller skating down the hallway, and you're like, that's the place I want to work, Yeah, because it was just, there was like parties going on in every little editor's room, little conferences and stuff like that. A much more like free-form creative environment.
Yeah. So what year did you originally join Marvel?
76.
76. And what was the first book you worked on, if you remember?
The book called The Champions, which, believe it or not, actually had Hercules in it. But
We'll get to Hercules later.
The Champions is a really funny story, but it's too long to tell here. But, if you find some other interviews with me, I've told the long version of the story, which is hilarious. But I kind of fell into it. But what happened was back in those days, too, none of the older guys, the seasoned professionals, wanted to do team books because there was too many characters.
Yeah.
So all the schmucks got the team books, It's like, so I did the X-Men, I did the Champions, then I went over to DC again for another year because they offered me $5 more a page. Yeah. We got paid like $20 a page back then. I mean, it was like nothing. So $5 more was a lot.
Yeah.
So I went over there for a tumultuous year, and more team books, Star Hunters, Justice Society, and finally, that's where I met David Michelini, my writing partner, and the two of us decided to jump ship and go back to Marvel. David had never worked for Marvel; he wasn't a Marvel guy. And they would try you out on books that they were going to cancel. The new talent, because I was still considered a newbie, right? And one of the 3 books that they offered Dave and I as a team was Iron Man. And Dave had no idea who Iron Man was or whatever, because he was a DC guy.
So before we get to Iron Man, because that's definitely a pivotal turning point in your career, what was it actually like? What was the process of creating a comic at that time? Like from cradle to grave, would you go in and pitch some ideas? How long would it take to actually make the book every week?
Well, I was not in the pitchy idea mode then, because like I said, when you're asking about when I was a snotty-nosed kid just trying to get work.
So they're telling you what to do, essentially.
Yeah, they're telling you what to do until you kind of make your bones, as they say in the mafia.
Then what was your deadline every week? Like you'd come in on Monday, and like what'd you actually have to accomplish?
Friday was payday. So everybody would turn pages in on Friday and pick up a paycheck, right, from the following week. And that's kind of how that process was, which was great at Marvel because Friday turned into a big party. Everybody sitting around showing what they were doing. We're all sitting around in the bullpen waiting for Millie to come down with the checks. So it was a lot of fun. But at that point, no, I took whatever they gave me. Because you have no reputation, you have no credibility, and keep in mind, in those days, DC published about 15 titles, Marvel published about 20. You literally had to wait for someone to die to get a book. You advanced by attrition a lot of times. So that's why I worked as a background assistant when I couldn't get work, steadily. As a penciler inker, and of course, writing was impossible. Yeah. So I took whatever was there until that fateful moment. Yes.
So let's talk about that moment. So everyone, Iron Man's ubiquitous. Literally, the cinematic Marvel universe built that universe around Iron Man, which we'll
ask David Maisel.
Yes, we'll get into the movies in a little bit, but it's hard to remember back to a time when something as iconic as Iron Man was literally on the shelf about ready to be booted.
Oh yeah,
it was a dead, dying comic, and they give this to you. What was your initial thought? Was it just like I'm lucky to have my own book to write on, or what?
Life is filled with mind-numbing coincidences. You've heard me say that over and over again, and this was one of them. I hated Iron Man. As a kid, I hated it because it was never what I thought it should be. I saw all the potential wrapped up in it. I was 11 years old, and I was drawing my own Iron Man comics on like notebook paper, right? Because to me, it seemed like they missed the point. It wasn't about the armor, it's about the guy. As a 15-year-old, I did not see being Iron Man as a viable, life choice, in terms of a role model. Because I'm not going to put on a flying suit and go around, and do whatever Iron Man does. But Tony Stark, and at the time, in this is mid-70s, I'm like, he should be like Mick Jagger. If Mick Jagger walks into a restaurant, everybody loses their mind, right? He's Tony Stark. He's the most brilliant man in the world. You know, I mean, he owns the Avengers. You know, I mean, it's like he owns half the world. I mean, nobody was having fun with him. He was just a means to get him in the armor. And so and the other thing was it never looked like armor.
Yeah.
And I grew up reading the Arthurian legends and drawing cars because I was in Indianapolis. I used to like draw shiny metal cars. And it always bugged me that it never looked like armor, never looked like metal. So when Marvel offered me this book that was one of the 3 that was going to be canceled, because like I was saying, what they would do is they would move when they knew a book was going to be canceled. This is back when it was all still on the newsstand. They knew about 6 months in to their 12-month contract with the distributors, the mobs, basically, whether a book was going to make it. So in 6 months, they would get the sales figures, and then they would decide that they were going to cancel it. So what they would do is they'd move John Buscema or one of these, big guys, Jack Kirby or whatever. They move him off, and they would put schmucks like us on and just finish out the run, right? So when they offered Iron Man, I just told David, I said, trust me. Just trust me, okay? I said, yeah, we'll take it. And I said, can we make a few changes? And then, we don't care. We're going to cancel the book anyway. So, as they say, the rest is history. We changed the entire concept of the Iron Man book.
So let's go through some of those changes you made, because I think it was one of the first examples of really personalizing a superhero beyond the cape, right? Like you really got into what this person's day-to-day life was, what his inner demons are, pun intended. So what was those initial changes that really you wanted to hammer home?
Well, my feeling was always that every book needs a hook. All right? Like with Spider-Man, we know what the hook with Spider-Man is. He's people presume he's a man superhero, but in reality, he's a teenager.
Yeah.
And he has all sorts of problems. He has money problems. Can't get a date for the prom. I mean, it's like he's got a doting aunt who's always sick. I mean, stuff that really made him unique to, the mythology that was at Marvel.
Yeah.
And I looked at Iron Man and I said, okay, what's Iron Man's hook? What's Tony Stark's hook? And the hook is that he's King Arthur. If you look at him in because I told you I was influenced by the Arthurian legends, you look at him as like, he has an empire. He has a shiny metal suit. He has Knights of the Round Table, the Avengers. And he doesn't fight crime. What he does is he looks after his own interests because his own interests benefits the world. So, it's like, unlike any other character, he's probably the most self-serving of the bunch. So what we wanted to do is wrap him in a corporate world, something that they really hadn't messed with a whole lot. So we created a whole corporate mythology. We created the Roxxon Corporation. We created Justin Hammer. We created a new pantheon of villains for him, right? And we also wanted to get rid of the heart problem. Now, he has had the heart problem since the Vietnam War, okay? We're talking like what? 60s, right?
Yeah.
And even in the mid-1970s, heart transplants were commonplace by then, and I'm kind of like, here's the smartest guy in the world. He can't figure out how to, fix his heart.
Yeah.
And I said, and I got sick as a kid because every time he'd be in a fight, he'd fighting the Mandarin, he's just about to win. And on page 22, he'd go like, I ran out of power. And he'd have a heart attack. And I don't know anybody who's had 50 heart attacks and lived other than Dick Cheney, and it's like, even then, it made no sense for him to have that problem. So David and I really took a close look and said, let's look at the corporate world. What's a corporate problem? And my philosophy about comics, I've always said that, you heard me say this, comics really aren't innovative in the sense that they create stuff that you've never seen before. What it is a mirror that reflects what's ever going on in society right now. And at that time, the Betty Ford Clinic had just opened up, and they had were just now in the media talking about addiction and alcoholism openly. So it made kind of sense, like, okay, this is something that he's going to have to live with the rest of his life. This is something that's always going to be gnawing at him. His obsessive compulsive behavior that gets out of hand. And so we created that. The whole first year was this build up to Demon in a Bottle, which was Tony's actual struggle with alcoholism, which was Robert Downey's favorite comic, by the way.
Well, I mean, you think of these iconic brands or images or things you've seen, whether it's, a Coca-Cola label, but I think anyone who's into comics would instantly recognize the cover of Demon in a Bottle.
It's funny. It's the only comic title that the general public is aware of.
Yeah.
It's like, it's amazing. I have become the unofficial spokesperson for sobriety in the comic industry. I get letters all the time. I still do.
Yeah. And you yourself have been sober for a long time.
36 years. Yeah.
And you weren't at the time, though.
No, that's the amazing thing. I was a raging alcoholic when I did it. But I look back at it as a cry for help. I think it's why it resonates, because it was real. I mean, I was in that cycle that I couldn't get out of.
So how much of Tony Stark, after you took over, is you?
You can answer that.
Well,
better.
I can, but
you can answer that a lot better than I could. But a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, you know me.
I mean, you
know this mouth. I'm being on my best behavior here.
He is, but you have a swagger and a way you talk that as soon as I met you,
too.
You do. But as soon as I met you, I was like, oh, you are Tony Stark.
Well, Downey even said that to me when we were on the set. He's, because I was mouthing off to one of the guys from New York who was there, one of the grips and whatever. And he's like, I said something smart ass, and he's kind of like, you're really more like Tony Stark than I am. I said, yeah, I know. It's not a compliment.
No, it could not be. How long were you actually on the Iron Man book?
I did two stints on it. I did about 35, 40 issues, then left because I had a chance to write on my own. And that's what I did, the infamous Hercules,
which was what I was transitioning to. So, and it's apropos because Thor: Love and Thunder just came out, and
you never saw a more happy guy at the post credits than me.
Spoilers, but there might be a character that Bob had a lot of influence on that might pop up in the movie. But let's talk about Hercules and what that was like, because there really wasn't a lot of examples of the limited series type.
It was the very first limited series ever done. That's another one of my little feathers in my cap. I beat Wolverine by 2 weeks,
which is all that matters.
Yes, which they adapted into the film, The Wolverine. But I was, since I wrote and drew it myself, but it was a weird pitch, because I went to them and I said, I want to do a story about a 5,000-year-old god growing up, having to grow up, because Hercules was such an ass in the comics. He'd come down to New York once in a while, beat Thor up for no reason, and then go back to Olympus, right? He was just like a dick. Right? It's like, I always thought, I remembered those as a kid, and I said, but at that time, we just finished Demon in a Bottle, and we just, and a lot of heavy storylines in Iron Man. Frank Miller was doing the whole Elektra thing. The Dark Phoenix saga was going on in X-Men. And I said, I want to do something lighthearted and funny, because I think I'm a funny guy.
Yeah. You are.
Yeah. So I decided I wanted to poke fun in the entire Marvel universe. So I had Herc exiled into space, and he's not able to come home until he grows up. So he gets on his chariot, and off he goes to have a lot of space adventures. At the time, Star Wars had just come out too, right? So it was a perfect venue to have a 5,000-year-old Olympian god who parties, constantly out there with beings who are far more powerful than him, and having to contend with that and comport himself as an adult.
Yeah.
And this was really the story about him growing up. And so we did the 4 issues, and it was so popular, they made me go back and do 4 more.
And it's one of the few limited series that is still in print to this day.
Then I did a graphic novel, because then they asked for a graphic novel, so I continued the Future Saga. And my last work for Marvel was about 12 years ago, was the conclusion to the whole Herc space saga. Twilight of a God, which was the as the tagline goes, death has never been so funny. Which was featured a Galactus with a weight problem.
I love that image.
Yes. Well, he got so big he turns into a black hole. Is what happens.
I'm waiting for the movie adaptation of that.
Well, look. All I know is Kevin Feige was a big fan of Herc.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
It felt like just the cinematic universe. They've been working towards introducing the gods in some way or
well,
shape
they
or
only
form.
got one more Guardians of the Galaxy to go.
Yeah.
So it's like
where do you go from here?
Yeah, if they're gonna do space stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect venue to do that kind of stuff because it's silly.
It is. And I think he's the perfect fit.
It's
for
very
that.
much. It was really funny because Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok were very much in the same sort of vein that my Hercules thing was.
Yeah.
Straight adventure story, but every time we had a chance to stick our tongue in our cheek, we did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned the Wolverine book came out. You also worked on X-Men. In fact, I guess X Factor was your big.
I put together my next project was I put together the original X-Men, got them back together as a team, and that was just a Charlie Foxtrot from Boo though, because it was the first X book not done by the normal X-Men editors and stuff, and they just made my life a living hell. Balancing every single thing I wanted to do, and it was. But the thing was also, when they got the initial sales, because by that time the direct market was working, it broke all-time sales records. Yeah, it sold 750,000 copies off the bat, right? And they were freaking out because Marvel had never had a book sell like that. And so suddenly I had so many cooks in the kitchen with me that I have one real rule about whatever I'm working on, whether it's a movie or whether it's comic books or whatever, and you know that. When it ceases to be fun, don't do it.
Yeah.
Because that's the whole point about being a creator, other than you get to work in your jammies, but it's the fact that I get to have I've had so much fun doing what I'm doing, and they just took the fun right out of it. But X Factor went on to be a successful title for a long time. I left after the 5th issue. I just had enough, and I got drafted into the Secret Wars.
Yeah,
I'm the only person drafted into that war.
So you have a great story about Payday on Friday, where you'd go to get your paycheck, and you'd literally have a stamp on the back of it that says, "By accepting this check, Marvel owns."
Yeah, it was done in more confusing language than that. But basically, every time we endorsed a check, we signed our rights away.
As a creator, obviously, they were paying you to do the job, but
yeah, they paid me $20 a page.
True, but
and no royalties.
Which that was what I was bringing up. So, as you've seen all these characters you created, obviously you had a huge influence on Iron Man, but you're also the co-creator of the Scott Lang Ant-Man, Huntress, War Machine. I could rattle off a dozen. How has that relationship with Marvel or DC transformed over the years, where you weren't getting residuals, but now they sort of need you as one of the influences to come back and talk about it?
It's two-edged, but you worked in Hollywood. What kind of price can you put on goodwill?
Yeah.
You can't buy goodwill. And the one great thing about Iron Man and my contributions to that is that it's bought me an enormous amount of goodwill that you can't get otherwise.
Yeah.
My name is synonymous with this character. Most guys go through their entire career without ever being associated. You can't talk Iron Man without talking about me.
Yeah.
A lot, and it's like, I'm so grateful for that. Does it hurt when I see Roxxon Corporation show up in an episode of Daredevil or whatever? I get, yeah, it hurts a little. But I have a really wonderful relationship with Marvel Studios.
Yeah.
They've been more than kind to me. Like you said, I had a chance. I've gone to all the premieres I wanted to go to, and I get compensated from them for the stuff that I do get royalties on, and handsomely.
Yeah.
So.
And you do have a great relationship with your fans too. They go crazy for you.
I have kept, with the website and social media, I have kept my fans on the hook for 45 years.
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, they're aging out now, but it's like
there's always a new generation.
No, I get what's really amazing is I go to a con and I'll get third generation Iron Man fan. You know, third generation. You know, it's like his dad handed him down to his dad, and now this kid who's 11 years old is reading this stuff. He just read Demon in a Bottle. He comes up with me to sign it, and I'm like, how can you even know this exists?
Yeah,
you know, but it happens more often than not. It's amazing because Marvel has kept all that stuff in print in perpetuity. You know, over the years. And fortunately, so people are discovering it and rediscovering it all the time. Plus, it was published in 72 different languages, too, you know? So, I mean, I have huge fan base in France and in Germany and in Dubai, the Middle East. So it's like, and I've gotten to do so many things because of that goodwill. So
let's transition away from Marvel and DC and talk about the creation of Valiant, which I think is as powerful as a company at the time as a Marvel or a DC, with some really big books that people recognize to this day. Obviously, it's sold later, and there's a whole cinematic universe being built around a lot of the characters that you helped create at Valiant. Talk a little about the creation of Valiant, what the reasoning behind it was.
The reasoning behind it, I don't know if there was a lot of reasoning.
You wanted to do your own thing.
Well, no, I wanted to own a piece of what I created. That's something you couldn't do at Marvel at the time. They didn't have, this was the late 80s. They didn't really have I was on my second run of Iron Man. And I was approached by Jim Shooter and Steve Mazarski, who were putting together, well, actually, they started out raising money for a Superheroes on Ice show.
I have not heard that.
Yes, this is how Valiant started. It was going to be Marvel Superheroes on Ice, which I would like to see, by the way, you know? And that fell through. But with the money that they had, they decided to start another comic book company. So I was always the idea guy at Marvel. You know, I was up in the bullpen on a Friday, and one of the editors was like, hey, I got a problem with this character. You got any ideas on how we could solve this kind of thing or whatever? And I would just pump stuff out because my brain is always going 90 miles an hour. So so they basically asked me if I would be willing to give up my contract at Marvel, which I'd been on with benefits and all that stuff, and come over and start the startup company and create characters create a universe. And that's kind of how, so I quit Iron Man at the height of popularity of the thing and went off to a tumultuous couple of years of doing Nintendo and wrestling comics.
Yeah.
We got the rights to the Gold Key stuff, which was Solar, Magnus, and Turok. And we were supposed to start out with a superhero thing, and I had EXO ready to go, right? And they decided they got the license for Nintendo and wrestling, and they decided instead that they were going to go do that. And I fought from the beginning. Like, wrestling people don't read. They don't read comics. They don't read about wrestling. They go watch it because there's so much. And it's like same with Nintendo. They don't read about Nintendo. They play it, you know? It's not a target audience, and time proved me right. So they blew through their entire investment in the first year and lost their shirts. So they had the venture capitalist Triumph, who financed it, had to put up more money to get us going. So we finally got into the superhero business. So yeah, we started with the Gold Key stuff, Magnus and Solar, and then we launched EXO, which turned out to be our best-selling book. You know, actually, there's a very interesting story about that. Originally, my concept for the book, it was just called Man of War, right? Which was Conan in a can. I took Conan the Barbarian, something I loved from like Robert E. Howard youth, reading with the Frazetta covers and all that, you know. And I took the idea, how can I do Iron Man and do it totally different? Well, I'll take Conan and give him Iron Man's armor, see what happens. All right? So it's Conan in a can. All right, that's the basic concept, and it was wildly popular. Okay, but John Hartz, who was one of the most brilliant marketing guys I've ever met in my life, he comes up to me and it's like, this is 1990, right? And he says, what's the number one book out there on comic shops shelves right now? And I said, X-Men, Jim Lee. He goes, what do you think about calling it XO Man of War? XO.
Yeah, was that because it would be facing?
It would be right next to X-Men, right?
That's genius.
And John was a genius, and as a result, people saw it and picked it up when they bought, because everybody was going to buy their Jim Lee X-Men, right? In fact, Marvel sent a letter of cease and desist to Mazarsky, right? Who was a lawyer by profession, right? He said they own the letter X. And he says, "Well, I'm going to trademark the rest of the alphabet and put you out of business."
Yeah,
is what he wrote him back. Obviously, it went nowhere.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you also did Bloodshot as well, and
I co-created. With the exception of Harbinger, I co-created the entire universe. But Valiant was a team effort all the time, working with very creative newcomers and with seasoned professionals. It was a Camelot. It was a place where everybody had a voice, from the janitor to the people in accounting. If they didn't like something that was going on in the books, we would talk about it. We would get together on Wednesday, a big powwow on the floor, and we'd just talk about the company. What we didn't like, what we liked, kind of, like Helios in the For All Mankind. It was that kind of open environment. It was an amazing time, without doubt. And in fact, 2 years later, we won Publisher of the Year, voted by the retailers of America. First time ever an independent comic company beat Marvel or DC. So that was one of the proudest moments of my life. I think Jason actually has it on film somewhere.
We need to transition now to your movie career. Before we do, let's talk a little bit about the sale of Valiant, because that happened years ago, but it's finally sort of seeing its seeds that were planted bloom with Sony's own
decades,
cinematic universe. And I think they were waiting to see how Marvel handled theirs, and they seem to be now going forward with it. But
we got to remember that the rights to that stuff changed hands a couple of times too.
Oh, absolutely. But let's talk about the sale of Valiant. So, I mean, that was, I won't get into that, how much it sold for, but
$65 million.
It wasn't
for a $4 million startup. That wasn't bad.
That wasn't bad at all. But that led to you not necessarily getting out of comics, but transitioning to another phase of your life, which was, let's see if we can make this work in Hollywood.
I not right away, but can we talk about mind-numbing coincidences?
Yeah.
Remember, because I say that the second mind-numbing coincidence was I started my career at Marvel. It was located at 575 Madison Avenue on the 10th floor. The day I signed the papers to sell Valiant and become a millionaire myself, it was at the law offices at 575 Madison Avenue on the 10th floor.
Yeah, which is amazing.
It's just like full circle. The end of my career and the beginning of my career all happened in the same place.
That's amazing.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. My life is full of things like that.
Astronomically impossible for that to have happened.
I dated 2 girls with the same name at the same time.
So let's transition to
Sorry, Deborah.
If she's watching. Let's transition to your Marvel career in the cinematic space. So prior to, I mean, obviously you had the Tobey Maguire Spider-Mans, but there was not a whole lot of success bringing a comic book to life cinematically. Blade made a lot of money. X-Men did okay.
X-Men was really the first one to be successful, I think, yeah.
But as far as bringing the Avengers and let's say the core group of the Marvel characters together, it really was Iron Man is the thing that kicked it off.
Marvel had made that horrible deal where they sold off the rights, like when they were in bankruptcy around the year 2000. They sold the rights to their mainstream characters, X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, to other studios. They were only getting a merchandising royalty for that. I mean, it was everybody says it was one of the worst deals in history. And it took Kevin Feige, a decade to iron that all out, but it was like one of the worst deals ever made.
They're still trying to unwind it. This is why we haven't seen the mutants necessarily in the cinematic universe yet.
Yeah.
Because they have just gotten those back.
Well, so after I sold Valiant, I retired. I decided because it sounded really good to retire. And that's how I wound up being a Floridian, I hated cold weather, and I wanted to move down here. And at the time, I was married to Jason's wife,
For those listening on the podcast, he's behind us.
Jason's right over there. He's filming this for a documentary, actually. So, but he's my little brother, and I love him. But so we moved down here, and that's my first stint in Florida. But I got out of the business altogether.
Yeah.
So I got a boat and a dog, and basically just tried to take it easy. I got so bored, though, and I started a company down here called Future Comics, because Dick Giordano, my other mentor, had a great idea, because it was just the beginning of e-commerce, and he thought, what if we did a comic book company and we sold directly to comic shops and we bypassed Diamond?
Yeah.
And it was like a brilliant idea, because our overhead, I mean, the bottom line, cut it in half, because they take 60% of the cover price, right? So if we sold directly to comic shops, we wouldn't have to have giant print runs in order to be profitable.
that was Colony, your first like.
Well, it was Free Mind, Death Mask, and Metallics. Okay. And Colony was the last thing the Future did, but I was getting to Colony, because that was one of the first web comics ever done in the U.S. too. But that's another story, right?
Yeah, and we don't have time for all those. So.
No, but I'm saying, so I did Future, but Future failed because most of the comic shops in America in 2002 or whatever weren't wired into the internet. I mean, that's how new the internet was. I mean, half the comic shops in America didn't have it, so we couldn't sustain the model. So it failed.
It's amazing, because that model's come back now online with Patreon and everything else. Like, you were so far ahead of the curve.
We'll give Dickie a lot of credit, but I've always been entrepreneurial. That's why I've been on both sides of the desk. I know what it's like to be a boss. I know what it's like to work for a boss. It's like being a boss is better. But what happened? So after Future folded, what I did was I turned my BobLayton.com into an entertainment site. I started doing columns and exclusive art for the website, and I talked Dickie, who had retired at that point. I talked him into I said, look, I want to do a comic where we publish monthly. We do 5 pages a month, and we just continue the saga on. It's going to be an epic, and it's going to go 145, 150 pages long. But 5 pages a month for you is nothing. He's like, oh, yeah, okay, I'll do it. He's cool. So we started Colony, which was a sci-fi epic about a prison in space, a literal Devil's Island in outer space. And it was for mature audiences and stuff like that, but it really took off. I mean, we had 600,000 unique hits on that every month.
Which is amazing, because, again, this was the infancy of the internet.
But I had fans in Korea and Australia and, all over the place. So that's what I was doing when I got the call to come out to Hollywood. Yeah. That was 2007.
Which we can't go into most of the sordid stories from your days out in Hollywood. It would take us too long, and we try to keep this podcast to an hour. So let's focus in on that phone call you got when you heard that, hey, Iron Man's being brought to life on the silver screen. What was that moment like for you?
I only found out what happened afterward. What I got was, because I was like persona non grata at Marvel at the time, Marvel Publishing, right? Because I had the editor-in-chief was somebody I had fired at Valiant. So he didn't like me a whole lot, okay? And I wasn't all that interested necessarily in getting back into comics anyway. But suddenly I get from the associate editor, or the second in command there, Tom Brevoort, I get this very nice letter asking me if I would be interested in coming back and doing some Iron Man stuff and picking up the mantle. And you're one of the bricks in the Marvel house that ideas, it's like, and I'm kind of, well, this is very curious, just out of the blue. Yeah. So I went back to work there at Marvel. It wasn't until they called me in 2007. So I did a couple of miniseries. I did I did the third part of the Doctor Doom Iron Man Camelot saga, and did another Hercules, right? It wasn't until I got the call, though, to come out to Hollywood to do the special features for the DVD that I found out that it was David Maisel that had asked Marvel, like, David Maisel was the founder of Marvel Studios. He's the guy who started the whole thing. And if you ever wonder why they started with Iron Man, all you need to do is look at David Maisel's house. It's a Bob Layton art museum, okay? It's nothing but Iron Man. So he was one of my most ardent fans. I mean, he just absolutely loved my Iron Man. So it was no coincidence. Yeah. He even said this to me, which was the best compliment I ever had in my life. He said there would be no Marvel Studios if it wasn't for my love of your work. And I'm, that I almost cried, I was like, oh my God, that's almost shameful, to think about, but it's absolutely true. So I only found out from David Maisel later that he had basically, like, Bob's my favorite Iron Man guy. Why isn't he doing Iron Man anymore? Well, it's because the editor-in-chief hates his guts. So that doesn't fly, So I went back to work at Marvel. Then I went out there, and I loved it out there. It was just a new challenge. And so I decided to take a shot at it. I had done everything in comics.
Yeah.
The webcomic was over with. So kind of like, but I never seen my characters move and talk and stuff,
Yeah. And so when you were at the premiere, you see Iron Man for the first time on the big screen. What was that like?
I don't know. You ever have one of those moments where you see something so gripping to you as a person that the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up like it feels surreal? There was a shot where when he first test flies the Iron Man armor, where it's a bird's eye shot where he's coming down to the mansion. And the mansion is pretty much what we designed in the comics. Yeah. And you see him put his hands down. He's coming down like this. And I had drawn that like 100 times. And to see that, when I saw that on the screen, it was just like, I got chills.
Yeah.
Because it was just amazing. And I told Downey, when I first heard that he was cast, I loved his work. And, with his career, with his history with Demon in a Bottle, that was perfect. I thought he was too old, to be honest, because my Tony was always like 35. He was supposed to be a child prodigy, right? So he was like 35. And I saw when I was out there doing the DVD stuff, I saw the first like takes from it. And I'm like, oh my God, he just ate the screen up. Just ate the screen up, man. So, yeah, never had a doubt about that. I told him to his face. Yeah. I said, when I finally met him, I'm like, but he so epitomized what my Tony Stark was, that smart ass, brilliant, lovable, but roguish.
I don't think they ever tackled the alcoholism.
He wanted
as
to.
much. And that was, you talk about someone who has a similar background with alcoholism, tapping into a character. I thought that would always been a perfect opportunity.
Downey had read everything I'd ever done, backwards and forwards. And Demon in a Bottle was his. In fact, when I got on the set of Iron Man 2, he had a trade paperback there for me to autograph. Yes. It was a very fun. It's mind-boggling that I'm signing autographs to Robert Downey Jr., Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
So here we are now, 2022. I think I just read where Marvel has 200 plus hours of cinematic universe content out there streaming right now.
Crazy, isn't it?
All the stuff they've made from there. And you've had so many of your characters come to life. Scott Lang, Ant-Man, War Machine, and now you're transitioning. Ghost.
God, let's not forget. Shout out to Hannah John Kamen. You're beautiful. You smell good.
You heard it here first.
Yes. She smells great.
You never tell me I smell great.
Well, no, you didn't come run down the red carpet and hug me like she did. Okay,
I did. But now you've got you're transitioning from the cinematic universe on the screen to the small screen on the streaming service with your upcoming Armor Wars series. That's really exciting because I think that's one of the better story arcs that Marvel's ever published that you had a huge influence over. So what's that like seeing?
That was the second big Iron Man tale.
Yeah.
Was we wanted to basically push Tony to his absolute limits morally. Like how far would he go to protect his own interests?
Yeah.
And the fact that he actually goes rogue in it, in order, he breaks the law. He violates international boundaries. It's like when he finds out that Justin Hammer had stolen all his technology and they were using it in all sorts of horrendous ways to cause harm. he becomes obsessed with getting it back. What I love about the Armor Wars, the TV series that they're working on, is it's going to be Jim Rhodes. Tony's dead. And it almost makes more sense that Rhodey would want to avenge his friend, keep his legacy from falling into the wrong hands. It almost works better.
Yeah.
So I am Yasser Lester, the guy who's going to write it. I hope to goodness I get to talk to him before he finishes the whole thing. But I have communicated back and forth with him a little bit. But I'm to me, I have a lot of hope for this.
Yeah.
We might see Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo finally, which would be awesome.
I think a lot of the work
great Iron Man villains never made it to the screen.
I think
we got Whiplash.
This is the perfect opportunity to bring some of them in. With that, unfortunately, we have to close out the podcast before we run out of batteries here. Bob, it's been an absolute pleasure with you. Thank you so much for being my friend and sitting in on this podcast with us.
Let's do it again soon.
Soon. Okay. There's more stories we didn't get to. But with that, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Loose Frame Podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Tyler Martinovich, and we just had a hell of a conversation with comic book legend Bob Layton.
Yes,
What'd you guys think of that?
What'd you think?
That was really impressive. I feel like I learned so much, not just about comic books, but about sort of the kind of creativity and innovation that comes into play behind the scenes. So that was really informative for me.
And just like the cutting your teeth and like working from the ground up. I just love those stories, how he was hustling his way to New York.
I've done a lot of interviews on this podcast over the last, year and a half. That was probably the hardest just because there's so much information. And if I did a disservice for the audience, it was that we couldn't cram in as many stories as Bob could tell.
Well, you used to work with them, right? What did you do together?
That's a long story. There's
not a short version of it?
Well, the short version is that I rented him some office space, got to know him really well. He was promoting sort of his new cinematic universe he was launching with another comic book creator who I will not mention because I don't know if he wants that out there.
Okay.
But it just was the wrong time. All of a sudden, 2008 hit and things were going downhill, and it just wasn't the optimal time to do those things. Chinese market crash, a lot of things hindered that. But anyway, that's how I know Bob, and I've known him for over 10 years. We had for a long time tacos every Wednesday without fail for years. So internally I knew the answer to almost every question, although there was a couple things he mentioned that I had never heard before.
Like what?
I will tell you, I've never heard the Avengers and Tony Stark phrased in an Arthurian framework, which I thought was really interesting with Tony Stark.
Are you talking about when he said he was picturing Tony Stark as King Arthur?
King Arthur, and the Avengers are the Knights of the Round Table, and it's sort of the corporate structure and fiefdom around that.
Yeah.
I thought that was really insightful. I'd never heard of it that way, and literally the entire time I was having that conversation with him, I was thinking about reframing just all the various adventure comics under that sort of guise of being a thinly veiled Arthurian legend. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know if he's ever said that publicly. Maybe he has. I mean, he's got hundreds of interviews, but that was kind of a gem for me. I've known him for a long time. Never heard that.
Yeah, and I liked hearing the backstory of Demon in a Bottle. He recreates that. I mean, that's the one image that he's most known for. So he recreates it once a year, you said?
Yeah. So it was voted recently one of the top 10 most iconic comic book covers of all time, which is impressive. I mean, like Bob said, it is one of the few, if the only Iron Man or Avenger comic book cover that is sort of ubiquitous. You ask anyone who has any knowledge about comic books, and they instantly know that image. Right. But he only makes one a year. Because if he didn't limit himself to one a year, he'd just be a human Xerox machine where
That's what he says. He's like, I don't want to be a Xerox machine. Yeah. I want to do it from the heart still.
which is it's cool though. In fact, I've got one in my office literally right now downstairs. But Hillary, going back to sort of the creativity you're talking about and the preparedness of getting into creating comic books, what was a takeaway that you thought was really interesting?
I just thought it was fascinating, some of the skills that he was talking about having, being able to work quickly, being able to take something and throw in new ideas, right? He was talking about how Iron Man was this one thing before he got to it, and he really was able to kind of inject some new life into that, not just through the suit, but through, like you said, Jesse, some of the characterization and emotions, and just kind of taking something that maybe no one was really interested in doing anything with it, and he turned it around and he turned it into something that is iconic, I mean, for people of my generation. So some of those skills that I didn't necessarily think you would maybe need as a comic book artist, but that he kind of monopolized on and really ran with.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you brought that up. You look at movies, right? And we have the term on a tour director, right? With someone that really has a indelible stamp that you could look back over their body of work and say, oh, that's a Jim Jarmusch film or whatever it might be. But you look at comic books, because of their longevity and just how many iterations they go through, any character is not sacrosanct. It really feels like they're just an amalgamation of different characters and creators throughout the years, whether it's Bob Layton or Jim Shooter, Chris Claremont, Stan Lee, like Steve Ditko, like they all had a very unique voice they brought to the individual books they were working on at any given time. And I think it's really cool to hear someone like Bob talk about what he specifically brought to the book and changed it. So I thought that was a really, really interesting point.
And off camera, I asked him, I was like, who's your favorite superhero growing up? And at first he was like, well, I hated Iron Man, which after this conversation, he couldn't relate to it. Nobody could. It was just a man in his gear. But he said it was Spider-Man. And Spider-Man and Iron Man have that one thing in common where they're just internally flawed. And it's more tangible to kind of relate to them and understand that they're working a lot harder than people that have, or the superheroes that have those supernatural abilities,
and I wish I had more time to talk about the difference between the MCU and the DC universe, but another comic book creator once framed it to me that capes, no capes, and if someone's wearing a cape,
I've never heard that before.
If someone's wearing a cape, even though there are plenty of characters in the Marvel universe that has a cape, but it's someone who's godly, who's typically not flawed, or if they do have a flaw, it's something so strange and archaic that you can't really relate to, like Superman, right? Perfect person, perfect individual, but kryptonite's is one thing. That's not really a flaw.
Right.
I mean, that's a defect in his armor, essentially, right? But like, what is he as a human? And it really wasn't until much later in the iteration of that character that you really start seeing some depth and nuance. But I feel like Marvel, as early as Spider-Man and some other characters, like they tried to humanize their characters a lot more than
and
DC
a good
did.
point. I'm not big on comic books. I feel like you are. I feel like you kind of are.
Thousands.
Yeah, I don't have a single comic book. But we're putting together an art gallery at Scarfoni Hartley at University of Tampa that's going to have all of these pieces of art from Bob Layton. But we were putting this together and coordinating it. We were talking to the curator, Jocelyn. And she is like a comic book nerd, and she would not get offended if I said that on camera. She's very proud about it, but she kind of brought to our attention that, around the time that Iron Man was recreated in the 70s by Bob Layton, it was kind of this moment in comic book history as a whole where people were realizing the social power and the social conversation that was coming out of comic books. Something that Bob said inside the conversation that you guys just had reminded me of that, where he was saying that comic books aren't just out of thin air, they're reflections of society, and they're like takes on, like artistic takes on it. So.
But, I think a good way to break it down is it's no different than what the Greeks were doing, trying to explain, the universe around them. It's Greek gods brought to life in a comic book. It's an Aesop's fable, right? There is a morality tale happening in every comic book, but particularly during the 70s, you look at what Stan Lee was doing and others with Marvel structure with like the X-Men. The X-Men is literally just an allegory for civil rights. And that's sort of pedantic. It's reductive, but there is a lot of what was going on.
Not to oversimplify it,
right? But there was a lot of what was going on at the time that is reflected in the comic book, just under the guise of mutants instead of African Americans or other minorities. So.
Yeah, what's another good example of that? I'm trying to think.
Well, one thing that Bob said during the interview that really struck me at the very beginning, he said that he was basically illiterate before he came to comic books, and that made me really think. So when you're a kid and you're in the classroom and the teacher wants you to read, they try to get you to grab a real book, and there's sort of this like comic books are less than, but I think what you guys are speaking to is that there is actually some real power in comic books, whether that's as a mirror to society or even like helping an 8-year-old pick up some words for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
They really, they're more than just what you kind of think of as like, comic books. Like there's some power there.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention in the podcast it was Bob's story, but I learned how to read off a comic book. So my grandmother got me this huge book set. It was probably, I don't know, 80, 100 books, and it was all of the classics: Charles Dickens, Moby Dick, House 7 Gables, 9 Gables, 8 Gables, I don't know, 7 Gables, 7 Gables. I said it right.
I see it in my head. I don't know.
I was thinking Anne of Green Gables.
Anne of Green Gables.
I'm thinking.
I don't know how many Gables there are, but they're green.
It's different. Scarlet Letter. But someone had taken the time to turn all these books into comic books.
Oh, wow.
And they were little like graphic novels. They're all around 50 pages, but it sort of distilled down those classic books. But it was really simplified. But, if I'm 6 years old and learning to read, like, these were amazing books and an entry into reading and learning that I just didn't get in school. I was fine in school, but like I was reading at a much higher level than just about anyone else in my class because of these. Just same thing with Bob.
Yeah.
So with that, let's transition to our social media followers.
Bob's also a filmmaker.
Oh,
He's
yes.
not just a comic book creator.
Yeah.
He's also he has his own movie production company.
He does. He's making a movie right now.
What's the movie?
I can't say because he didn't say, so I don't know if it's if I'd gotten to bring it up and he would have mentioned it, I would mention it.
What's the name of his company?
Future Comics.
Future?
Well, Future Comics was the name of his comic book company.
And it's Future Comic Productions.
It's Future Films is the name.
Future Films, got it. Okay,
Yeah.
Future Films. Very cool. But yeah, so we asked in light of talking about Iron Man, we asked our followers who their favorite Iron Man, just from, the films and the comics, who their favorite Iron Man villain was. And it came down to 4. It came down to Ironmonger, who's in Iron Man 1, the 2008 movie that launched it all. Whiplash, who is in Iron Man 2, played by Mickey Rourke.
I don't believe that anyone actually voted for Whiplash. I think you made that up.
I can show you hard data that a lot of people voted for Whiplash.
There are a lot of trolls on Instagram, is what she's saying.
And then the Mandarin, who was played in by Ben Kingsley in Iron Man 3, and then Doctor Doom, who was the comic book edition. So those are the entries that we got via Instagram. And then I had people vote on their favorites. So I had them vote between Ironmonger and Doctor Doom, and Doctor Doom won by 78%. Ironmonger was 22%.
Okay.
You listed Doctor Doom.
I did.
That's your favorite. Why?
He's a great villain. Doctor Doom is basically the shadow version of Iron Man, even though traditionally he was always like the Fantastic Four's like main villain. And I think if you look at like Iron Man, it was probably more Mandarin was his like main foil. But anytime you paired Iron Man with Doctor Doom, it was always a fantastic book.
All right. Take your word for it. And then between Whiplash and Mandarin, who do you think? Don't look. Who do you think won?
I hope it was Mandarin. I'm hoping, but her laughing tells me it wasn't. Which
it was
means
Mandarin.
Oh, thank God.
It was Mandarin, but 56%, 44% voted for Whiplash.
Mickey Rourke famously plays him in the movie, right?
Mm-hmm, yep.
And I wasn't going to bring him up on the podcast because Bob has some really great stories about Mickey Rourke.
Yep.
But since he decided to come out in the news and trash talk Tom Cruise, I'm fine saying something about Mickey Rourke. That was one of the worst portrayals of a villain in the history of cinema.
Well, it was
I'm going on record and saying
it
that.
was the accent. It was the accent for me. I
don't
want to talk too poorly about it.
It was everything. Yeah.
But yeah.
Whiplash wasn't a great
lot
character from the comic books. Either way, he was sort of a C or D lister. I thought Crimson Dynamo would have been a much better foil.
Crimson Dynamo.
Yeah. There's a lot of decent villains out there. But anyway, Hillary, do you have a favorite villain in comic books? Doesn't have. We'll broaden this out from Iron Man.
I really like. Well, can I go DC? I feel like I keep saying
no.
DC, even though
he worked for DC too. Yeah,
I like the Riddler. I feel like there's, but not in the most recent movie. I hated that. I thought that was just awful. There was like no joy in it whatsoever.
No, it was just Paul Dano being a dick.
Yeah, it wasn't what I
Pretty much.
recognized
Yeah.
from any kind of iteration of the character. But he would probably be my favorite.
Yeah. Do you like the Jim Carrey version?
I love the Jim Carrey version, yeah. but there's room for like a new, portrayal in cinema for sure.
Absolutely. The Jim Carrey one, it's funny. I hate that movie, but he's the best part of it.
I have to say the Joker. I know that's really corny to say. I just, every time I see anything with the Joker in it, and I do blame Heath Ledger for that, because that was just such a show-stopping performance, and it will, be timeless.
He gets a lot of credit for that, but I think if you're going to talk about Joker, it's the animated version is easily the best. I think Mark Hamill just started, and they really gave the character some pathos behind him. He wasn't just a chaos agent.
Mm-hmm.
He really felt like he saw himself as the anti-Batman, and he had to be that shadow for Batman to exist, which I really always liked, because they never ended each other, and they could have many, many times in the series, and it always came down to like, well, you're not going to kill me, Batman, or I'm not going to kill you, Joker.
Exactly.
And there's always that explanation. It's like, you can't exist without me, and I can't exist without you.
So from I saw it because it was a blockbuster movie, the Christian Bale as Batman, Heath Ledger. I loved Heath Ledger in that movie, but that kind of introduced me to the world of Batman, and that was my gateway to the Batman at all. And so I watched Mark Hamill as the Joker. I watched The Killing Joke.
Oh, that is a really extreme one to come in on.
And I was just like, whoa.
Yeah, that is a famously cruel series.
It's so good though.
Yeah.
Oh, so good.
Well, it just shows how damaging Batman can be too.
Exactly. He is kind of an anti-hero. I mean,
he's almost as psychotic as anyone else in this rogues gallery of villains. But with that, I want to again welcome Hillary. Thanks for joining the team here.
You didn't say who your favorite was.
Oh, do you really want to know?
It's me. He just said.
I did. She comes into work every day and just tries to foil my plots. No, but if you actually want to know, I've always liked Magneto as a villain. Not that he has anything to do with Iron Man, though. That would be a pretty good matchup, considering I don't know actually if Iron Man's costume is actually made out of metal. It's probably polyurethane, so I don't know. But that would be an interesting pairing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now we know.
There you go. Yes,
Well, with that, welcome, Hillary.
Yes, welcome. You'll be hearing more from Hillary as we continue on with the series. And again, new set, but same great content. So if you're enjoying it now, please keep liking and following our content. And by the way, continuity error, I'm wearing a different shirt. It's because between recording Bob and this, I might have spilled like half a gallon of nacho cheese on my shirt. So
I was just going to let it ride out.
That's all right.
I was just going to let the comments be
I'm going to draw attention to that. Well, with that, Jesse Brock, where can people follow us?
We are Loose Framing Podcast. Listen to us anywhere you stream podcasts or watch us on YouTube. And don't forget to follow us at Film Tampa Bay.
And with that, see you next time.